Kia ora koutou, everyone. It's now just on 2 o'clock, so we'd better just, if I can get Sandra maybe to do a quick roll call again for us to check that we've got most people back online.
Sure. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Yeah, present, Simon.
Councillor Bartley.
Present.
Councillor Casey. Councillor Collins. Councillor Coombe.
Kia ora no.
Councillor Cooper.
Yes.
Councillor Dalton. Councillor Darby.
Yes.
Councillor Filipina.
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher.
Good afternoon.
Councillor Henderson. Councillor Hills.
Kia ora koutou katoa.
Councillor Mulholland.
Good afternoon, present.
Councillor Newman.
Good afternoon, Sandra.
Councillor Sayers.
Yes, thank you, Sandra.
Councillor Simpson.
I'm here, Sandra. Thank you.
Councillor Stewart.
Good afternoon.
Councillor Walker. Councillor Watson.
Present, Sandra.
Councillor Young.
Good afternoon, Sandra.
Thank you, Mayor Goff.
Great. I think those that aren't here will be with us shortly. So welcome back, everyone. Now, this could take a short or a long time. So let's see how we go. We'll just work our way through the remaining 11 items. So the next item is the significance and engagement policy, and this is in regard to adopting a draft policy for consultation. We workshopped this. I don't think it was hugely controversial. Councillor Simpson, if I can ask you to move it, Councillor Filipina to second it, and if I can get Ross Tucker and Kenneth Auluputia to speak to it. Kenneth, are you leading it or Ross? Do I have either of you on the call?
Tēnā koe koro mātua, this is Eddie. Kenneth Auluputia will be leading this, just not sure if he's on, maybe give him a moment, Your Worship.
Okay, otherwise you're the fill-in substitute, Eddie, so I hope you're ready.
Hello, Your Worship.
Kenneth, welcome to the program. Let's, if you'd like to take us through that, and then we'll open it up for questions and then for comment.
Thank you, Your Worship.
We'll just make sure we've got your volume right, please.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. We are seeking approval on the draft significance engagement policy as the basis for public consultation. And given the significant decisions signalled on the horizon just from the discussion today, I would suggest that our mahi is quite timely. Mahi like this takes a village, and I have Ross Tucker, Justine Yu and Eddie Tuiavi'i who will also contribute to our kōrero today. The significance and engagement policy is undergoing a policy refresh to ensure that it remains contemporary and user-friendly. This was something that Council always intended to do after the policy was adopted in 2014, based on the premise that good policy for Tamaki Makaurau doesn't operate in a vacuum, it evolves as Tamaki Makaurau evolves. To be clear, the current policy is still largely relevant, but there is an opportunity to update it to reflect changes that have occurred in our public environment and to ensure it remains relevant into the future. So the goal of the policy refresh is to provide for a simplified decision-making process through a high-level guiding document that A, allows for case-by-case assessments, and B, continues to enable engagement that is inclusive and forward-thinking. At this point, I'll pass it over to my colleague Ross Tucker to talk to the scope and proposed updates to the significance side of the policy. Eddie Tuiavi'i will then follow and talk to proposed updates to the engagement side of the policy, talking to the consultation process and next steps. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Kenneth. So the significance side of the policy provides guidance about how the council considers how significant a decision is, and then that in turn helps us, gives us guidance around what's the appropriate process for engaging with the community and making the actual decision. As part of the refresh for the significance part of the policy, we're proposing to make some changes, minor tweaks really, that clarify that significance is a continuum. So rather than a binary thing about a decision is either significant or insignificant, it's a question of, well, how significant is it from low to high to very high. Also to clarify that when we think about the significance of a decision, often it's appropriate to look at a package of proposals or decisions together and look at it as a whole. Is that package, how significant is that whole package in its entirety? The significance part of the policy also lists the strategic assets of the council as defined in the Local Government Act 2002. There's lots of different kind of definitions of strategic and common usage, but a very specific definition in the Local Government Act. And that defines strategic assets as assets or the groups of assets the council needs to continue to own in order for it to achieve outcomes and services that are important to the well-being of its community. So as part of the refresh, what we've tried to do is review the list of strategic assets, not to do a line-by-line assessment, but just to really make sure that what we've got in the policy, the wording around it, the categorisation of assets aligns with the intention and definitions in the legislation. So the previous version of the policy was a bit unclear, kind of used some different terms. We've tried to make sure that the new wording aligns as close as possible to the legislation, just to improve clarity. In terms of the adjustments to the proposed list of strategic assets is all set out in the reports, and we've workshopped it. But at a high level, what we're trying to do is align the list of assets to the Local Government Act definition, and really a focus on, well, what are the assets required to, or groups of assets in order to required to deliver services. We try to reflect this view that most of the assets that council uses to provide its core services relate to groups or networks of assets, such as the network of water assets, networks of transport assets, etc. And a lot of that is in the current policy, and it's about refining and tweaking things across other things that don't quite align in the current policy. We are proposing here to remove some of the specific assets. So while some of the assets in the current policy are groups and networks, there are some specific individual ones mentioned. And some of them kind of get down into heritage assets, waterfront assets, which while we recognise as important to the community, we don't think they're kind of in that same level of critical for delivering core services. So what we're proposing is taking them out of the strategic assets list, but instead providing some more guidance. And we've introduced that by way of some significance guidelines of how we determine significance for those property type assets. So there's a new series of guidelines that sit alongside the policy that explains how we think about things like waterfront assets and heritage buildings and to determine how significant that is. And then that kind of leads us to taking a more fit for purpose consultation, which might involve, rather than an LTP amendment with auditors, a process that involves the local board, involves the interested part of the community, and gives us more fit for purpose and a bit more flexibility. So that's kind of, in essence, what we're trying to do with the significance side. So I'll now hand over to Eddie to talk about the engagement side of the policy.
Tēnā rawa te koe, Ross. As a brief prompt, the engagement section of the policy provides 5 high-level principles on how to engage most effectively and inclusively with the diverse communities of Tāmaki Makaurau. In keeping with the proposed parameters established by our learned finance colleagues and with the guidance and considerations from the combined workshop of both the PACE and F&P committees last month, the scope of the engagement updates, Your Worship, is also consistent with a refresh as opposed to a rewrite. The updates, 4 short updates, simplifying an existing text to make the policy more user-friendly, as Ali'iman Manu Kenneth alluded to. It's Engagement 101. Secondly, ensuring the engagement principles, again there are 5, capture a more diverse Tāmaki Makaurau. You'll all be acutely aware, elected members, that Tāmaki Makaurau in 2014, when this policy was written, versus Tāmaki Makaurau today are two quite different environments. Number 3, capturing the need to safeguard elected members and the community and staff during consultation and engagement. Look, this is consistent, Your Worship and members, with the guidance and the considerations given to us at the combined workshop last month, but also it acknowledges that the issues that we're tackling, the complexity of decisions we're tasked with making, as well as the expectations of our community and more, are all on the rise. We need to be able to consult and engage, deliberate and hold dialogue safely. Our proposed revision I put to you captures this acute need to safeguard everyone. Finally, this brings me to the next point. Our proposed refresh gives more visibility to the connection between the policy, which is being refreshed, and the engagement guidelines, which operationalise the significance and engagement policy. But it also supports staff in the organisation more generally when engaging and consulting. A separate refresh of the engagement guidelines will begin in Q4. Through the Chair Leader Maiava, and to use a journalism parlance, I'd now like to throw to Justine Yu to round out our kōrero. Kia ora.
Thanks, Eddie. I'll just introduce our next steps to wrap up our introduction. So our projected timeline for the next few months leading up to our end date of February 2022 is going to be short and sweet. Again, this is to reflect our policy refresh and just the fact that we're making very minor changes to the overall policy. Following today's adoption of our draft policy, hopefully, we will be running our public consultation starting on Monday, the 27th of September, to finish up on the 18th of October. We will be going to local boards for their local board workshops and views in November. And we will also be presenting the results of the feedback consultation to them. We will be going back to the local boards in December to formalize their views at their business meetings. And then from December onwards, we will be making additional adjustments to our draft policy to reflect the overall consultation views, with, of course, the goal being to return to governing body in February of next year to formalize and adopt a final policy, which will conclude this piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you to Kenneth, Ross, Eddie and Justine on that. So we'll begin with questions. I don't have any questions, but I do have a couple of comments. So I'll just pause for a second to see if there are any questions. Question, Wayne Walker.
Yeah, hi. So as it stands now, marinas, with the exception of Westhaven, are not strategic assets. Quite obviously, they're used for strategic purposes, including the transport network, placemaking, amongst other things. Are we going to be picking up on that?
It's Ross here. So we're not proposing to include marinas on the list of strategic assets. The transport network as a whole is. So I guess the parts of marinas used for ferry operations could be considered to fall under that broad category of part of an overall transport network. So it would be captured as a highly significant change, requiring an LTP amendment if we were to fundamentally change big parts of the transport network. What we're saying is that there's a whole range of other property assets, and that we think rather than including them on the list of strategic assets, there's a more appropriate way to deal with that through these new guidelines to determine the significance of those assets, and lets us then determine what is fit for purpose consultation and engagement. Just because it's not on the list of strategic assets doesn't mean that it wouldn't require consultation or even a special consultative procedure. Those are all considerations that are made on a case-by-case basis. But our view is that the marinas aren't kind of the same category as the road network and the water network in terms of providing core services, and in terms of the definition in the Local Government Act.
Through you, Ross, have we received some advice around that? If so, can it be made available? Because we know that the marinas and the areas where the ferries berth, which are owned by council, are part of the ferry network, and I'm assuming that the ferry network is part of the transport network, and we know that those marina areas would be incredibly important in respect of any civil defence emergency that took out the roading network. Obviously, we don't have a marina strategy that would have otherwise identified this, but in the absence of an informed answer, is there some information that you can forward to councillors that addresses the question I'm raising? Because I would suggest that the marinas do form a strategic asset. We have the precedent that Westhaven, which is a marina, is a strategic asset. My question is, what makes Westhaven as a strategic asset any different to Gulf Harbour, Pine Harbour, and the other marinas that council also owns and are similar in almost every principle?
Ross,
so that's a question.
Are you wanting to answer that?
Yep. So I guess in terms of advice, what advice we can share, there isn't anything specific. We've engaged with the legal team and others. At the end of the day, what assets are significant or not is a matter of judgment to be applied by each council. We're kind of reflecting. We've looked at what some of the other councils do. We've had a look at Wellington City Council, for example. They've got a very clear policy. We've tried to align things as much as possible to legislation. So it's a question of what are the core services and community outcomes the council's trying to achieve, and which assets are critical for achieving that. So we don't kind of see marinas as fall into that category, noting that they are important to local communities, as are lots of other property assets. But we don't see them as strategic, other than the parts of it that would form part of the public transport network.
Supplementary question then. So are you proposing that we take out the Westhaven Marina as a strategic asset on the basis of the principles that you've just outlined?
That's correct. So it's one saying it's not included on the current proposed list in this draft policy.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but currently it is a strategic asset. So you're proposing to take Westhaven Marina out as a strategic asset?
That's correct. So we don't see any basis to include one, but not others. Similarly, if you look at across the public transport network, the previous policy references Britomart, but doesn't reference a whole range of other busway stations or new city rail link stations. So we think it's appropriate to be talking about the network as a whole in terms of transport, and having a different approach for some of the property-based assets. That's what we're proposing. It is just a proposal for consultation, and we can make final decisions once we hear back from the community.
So further
last question,
supplementary
please.
Question. So are you saying that the busway stations that Auckland Council owns, that I would have thought were part of the transport network, an integral part, are not strategic assets? Is that what you're saying?
What we're saying that the public transport network is part of a strategic transport, a strategic asset, that the network as a whole is the asset. What we're not doing is listing every individual station, for example. So it's about the network as a whole, as it appears in the strategic assets, not individual components.
So
okay. Sorry, Wayne, you've had 5 questions. I'm sorry, I'm going to go to the next questioner at this point. Councillor Chris Darby.
Thanks, Mayor. Just a small one from me. Thank you, Ross. The change from social housing network to council's interest in housing for older people managed by Haumaru. Ross, there's a category of senior housing that we also own in addition to Haumaru you may be familiar with. I don't think there's a lot of it. There's some on the North Shore where there are groups of houses that are rented and they're not through Haumaru. Are you aware of those? And does that change capture that interest?
Not specifically aware of that. Maybe there's others on the call that know a bit about the detail there. What we've tried to do there is the legislation talks is very specific around social housing, and it has some wording. So shares in ports and airports and interests in social housing must be included in the list by legislation. We've tried to align the wording as much as possible to match the legislation. But I'm not quite sure about the details of those other particular ones. I guess if they fall within the legal definition, then I guess regardless of what we do with our policy, they'd be captured. I'm not sure if there's others on the call that are able to clarify anything better. It might be if there's further details, something we could look at post-consultation to just tidy up to make sure that it's 100%.
Yeah, look, just leave it there and we'll go to consultation and tidy it up later on. Thanks, Mayor.
Yep, thank you, Councillor. And this is a document for consultation, so depending on what comes back, we'll get a second bite at this one. Councillor John Watson, question, please.
Yes, thanks. I'm really trying to clarify the earlier responses to Councillor Walker in terms of the strategic nature of the transport network, and particularly as that might apply to marinas. So Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you're proposing to remove Westhaven as a strategic marina in the first place, but as far as marinas as a whole go, you said yes, there's parts of the marina that are a strategic asset, and when I think of the ones that I'm familiar with, if we're talking about the marina land, that's big significant parks, because in a number of instances they serve as park and rides in order to enable people to catch ferries. So in a number of locations, not least of which ones like Gulf Harbour, you're talking about a big proportion of the hammerhead, for instance, that forms that strategic function. So in practical terms, it's a little difficult to understand that, yes, they are strategic assets, or at least parts of them, and I'm suggesting quite significant parts of them, but they're not classified as such individually, but they are classified as such as part of the wider transport network. So I guess from the position of someone wishing to feed into this consultation, is it are they strategic assets or not, and what is the difference in their protection in terms of being noted individually as opposed to being part of the transport network?
So what we're proposing with this policy is to focus on groups or networks, and say that because the definition is around services and outcomes for the community. So what is kind of strategic here is the ability of the council to provide ongoing public transport services. So having a network of busway stations, a network of park and rides, a network of ferries is all integral to providing ferry services. So by saying that the public transport network as a whole is a strategic asset, what it means is if there was some changes that fundamentally, something changed with those assets that fundamentally meant we couldn't provide ferry services, or a significant number of ferry services or other parts of the public transport services couldn't be provided, then that would have a high degree of significance. But what we're not saying is individual assets and components are strategic in their own right, and therefore any change to any particular component would require a full LTP amendment, full public consultation, auditors to come in, a 20-page, say, plus consultation document. So we don't think that's the right approach for individual assets within part of a broader network. It's about, is there a major change to the service and the network of assets that underpin that service.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up, and you were drifting in and out there, Ross. I missed parts of it, but one of the protections of being a strategic asset is that consultation process that it triggers through annual plan or long-term plan. So in the past, we have moved to dispose of marinas, for instance, without any such consultation. So are you saying now that if someone was to contemplate that again, because they're part of the strategic transport network, it would trigger that consultation requirement of a strategic asset because it is part of a strategic network?
So under the current policy, either things are a strategic asset and that triggers a full LTP audited amendment, or it's not a strategic asset and the policy gives no guidance around what you should do with consultation. So it's kind of an all or nothing approach. What we're trying to do here is create more of a spectrum and kind of go strategic assets are the big decisions that have significant impact on services. That's one end of the spectrum. And then what we're saying is that with other property-based assets, we've introduced some new guidelines that talk about how significant a decision is and what sort of consultation could be required. So it may well be that if there's a change to marinas that might require an SCP, it might require consultation through an annual budget might be appropriate. So consultation just through an annual budget wouldn't meet the requirements for a strategic asset because it's not an LTP amendment. So what we're trying to do is saying, well, what does fit for purpose consultation mean? And maybe some things are not SCPs, they're more Section 82 consultation where the local board can, for example, could lead the discussion with the local community in different ways and figure out what's the best way to actually engage with the community in the circumstances. So it's about, rather than all or nothing, strategic assets, and it's got this process is or nothing, it's a bit more a spectrum and fit for purpose consultation.
And that would allow for changes that make certain assets more important strategically than they were previously. For instance, climate change demands, as time ticks by, some assets are going to become even more strategic in terms of coping with the effects of climate change. So that's allowed for in this as well?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So you'd consider case by case, what are all the considerations and how strategic is it? And is the consultation fit for purpose given all of those kind of factors?
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Kathy, you've put a question on the sidebar and there's been an answer.
Thanks, Phil.
Kenneth.
Yeah, I'm really supportive of this draft policy. But Kenneth, I'd like you to talk a wee bit more. We've concentrated on the significance part of it, and I'm really keen to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the improvement to at least our ideas to improve consultation. And two aspects for me are highlighted in the draft. One is improving safety, and I'd quite like you to talk about what has prompted that. That's the safety of elected members, staff and the community. We spend a lot of time in consultation. And the second one is that 20% of Aucklanders have a need for access, whether it's sight impairment, hearing or literacy. And I'm interested in your focus on that in this draft.
Thank you, Councillor Casey, for the question. So it's a very interesting point. And I guess when we talk about changes in the environment and some of the situations that we've faced over recent years or recent times when we've gone out to engage, there have been challenges that we've had to face as an organisation in regards to going into environments that are potentially hostile, not just with staff, but with different community groups coming to the table who are very passionate about their views, to ensure that we are protecting the safety and well-being of everybody in attendance. So to this end, the engagement guidelines we think is the best way to look at operational solutions that we can put in place to help alleviate what is often, just what can be at times very passionate groups who've got a perspective, but just ensuring that the conversation, the dialogue is one that is constructive and safe for all present. So we are working with our health and safety team, our wellbeing team for a start. We are looking at what security we can put in place that still allows our staff to do what they need to do from an engagement perspective, but know that there are professionals in place if necessary to help and support. And we're talking to the advisory panels and the community groups directly to understand their perspectives and their challenges so that we ensure the guidelines that we come up with in this space take into account what they think will work best to, as you say, allow them better accessibility, but also provide a constructive environment for meaningful engagement dialogue when we go out to consult.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ken. That's great.
Thank you. Now, Councillor Walker, you've got 2 more questions in the sidebar. Can you ask each of those, and then I think we'll move to comments.
Yes. So when I look at the list, I see a list of stadiums, but Western Springs is missing. I see community halls, but also I don't see leisure centres. I would have thought that they would have been strategic assets as well. In some instances, leisure centres and libraries are combined. And under public transport network, quite obviously it mentions Britomart, but there is no reference to the ferry network as part of the public transport network, even though the roading network is specifically categorised. So for consistency, I would have thought we would have had the ferry network identified. And in addition to that, I'm not sure whether there may be interests in parts of the rail network that we would want to identify as strategic assets, or again, is that implicit in public transport network? So a couple of specific things I'm homing in on: leisure centres and Western Springs Stadium missed, and then public transport network, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross, that's back to you, is it?
Yeah, so I think here you may be looking at the current version of the policy. So I think in the documentation it's got the current version of the policy and the proposed new policy. So I think some that might, if you look at the current version, that might clear some of these things up. So what we're saying is it's the public transport network. We see ferries as part of it, but I guess equally, Auckland Transport is trying to move in towards more integrated networks. So having the roads and park and rides and ferries work together, having rail and bus interchanges, and being able to seamlessly move from one mode to another, with hop cards, etc., is a key part of how we think about how Auckland Transport thinks about public transport as one network. So it's about public transport network. That's the service. The service is moving people around through public transport. In terms of community facilities, I think we have on the list community facilities as kind of the headline, and then we make it clear that includes libraries, halls, leisure centres, and the rest. So that the idea, again, the direction we're heading in is more multi-use facilities. So rather than specific purposes, the idea is it's the network of community facilities, including all of those different things make up that network of community facilities. And then in terms of stadiums and venues, we're treating that as one network, and we give some examples of what are the definition. We make it clear we're talking about all of the stadiums together as a network.
Okay, look, I think we want to now move to comments. So I've got the first comment in the name of Councillor Linda Cooper. Linda, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've been very comforted by Ross's explanation that we're talking about networks. So if any network is disrupted by any proposition, then it will be consulted on. Really, my comments are around public safety, staff safety, elected members' safety at consultations, and I do an awful lot along with usually a team of a couple of councillors, IMSB members and staff in bylaw policy, and we've had some pretty hairy types of responses from people throwing things at staff, local board members abusing us actually, so all sorts going on, sometimes fellow councillors. So I think this is a really good move because we have to do these sorts of consultation in good faith, and that means everybody remaining calm and getting an opportunity to be heard, but also when they're heard, to let other people have a turn and respect all the people in the process. So I really endorse that part of it as well as the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Desley-Simpson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I'll just keep mine brief. I'm happy to move this, and I want to thank Kenneth, Ross, Eddie and Justine for their work on this. I also want to thank them for the huge amount of time that they put into the workshop answering everyone's questions that was chaired by both myself and Matua Alf Filipina. Look, we keep an open mind on this, but in essence, all this is an update because, as has been mentioned, Auckland has moved a bit since 2014. It's simplifying existing text. We will always want to make our material more user-friendly. It actually is ensure that we can engage better because the principles capture a more diverse Auckland, which of course we are now, and of course the need to safeguard staff and ourselves and the community during engagement. That of course, as well as giving a further sort of joining up between the policy and the forthcoming and separate refresh of the engagement guidelines. So I'm happy to move, noting it does go up for public consultation, knowing that we do have an open mind, but I believe some of the changes are for the better, most definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. You're already down as having moved it, and Councillor Filipina as having seconded it. So that's all been done and dusted. Councillor Wayne Walker.
So just speaking to the item, I'm very encouraged that we're revisiting the strategic assets. I am concerned though, because there are assets that I would consider that are strategic that don't appear to be identified to the extent that I think members of the public would understand. There may well be items that members of the public regard as strategic assets that aren't identified. And so I would suggest that if it's possible, accompanying the consultation, we actually have some listing of other assets. For example, is the council administrative building on the corner of Wellesley and Albert Street a strategic asset? Because as it stands now, I'm trying to see where an asset like that fits, because it doesn't appear to be in the list, though I may be missing something there. So I think there's a little bit more work required here in terms of what we go out to for public engagement around things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We are in comments now, Kenneth, so unless it's pretty vital, it'd be unusual to ask staff to come back in and comment once the discussion is already underway. Okay. I will then put the motion. It's been moved and seconded, and this is to approve the draft significance and engagement policy for public consultation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
To the contrary, no. I
No.
declare. Okay, and we'll note that that wasn't carried unanimously. I'll declare it carried, and we move to item number 13.